first. Let me make sure nobody's in the waiting room. Welcome. So before we go ahead and get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items just to ensure easy participation for everyone. So first, as you'll see, you've been automatically muted upon entering the webinar. If you have any questions throughout or want to add anything to the discussion, please feel free to add any of your questions to the chat. If you're unsure how to do so, you'll click the More button on the bottom tab of the Zoom call and then press chat, and you'll be able to message everyone with any of your questions. We will be going through at the end, and the speakers will answer any questions you have, so feel free to write them in there throughout the call. As you saw upon entering, we are recording this webinar, so thank you for providing your consent to be recorded. We will be posting it on educatingalllearners.org afterwards, both the slides and the recording for your reference. Third, if you're listening on your computer speaker system and would prefer to join over phone, you're welcome to do so by clicking in the lower left corner, the upward arrow, and then selecting switch to phone audio. And then again, fourth, I just wanted to remind you all to chat any questions you have, including any technical difficulties you may have. Please feel free to message either myself directly, I'm Gabrielle Oates, or you can message in the general chat and we'll be able to respond accordingly. So yeah, I'll go ahead and pass it over to our speakers today. Again, thanks for everyone joining us.
Great. Hi, this is Lindsay Jones. I'm the President and CEO of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. We are so excited to be here today to share with you all the updates that have been happening and some great information about this new alliance that we are so proud to be a part of. I want to first introduce my co-presenters today and then talk a little bit more about the alliance itself. You can see them probably on your screen in many places. First, Ace Parsi. He's our Director of Innovation. He's been with us for about 4 years, and he's going to go over some key laws and key terms. And next, Megan Whitaker. She's been with us for 7 years. She is our Director of Policy and Advocacy, and we'll go over just the current state of guidance that's been shared by the U.S. Department of Education. So with that, let's talk a little bit about this alliance. What is EALA, as I guess we're calling it, educatingalllearners.org. As I mentioned, NCLD is proud to be a founding partner in this group, a very unique coalition of so many people who care about students with disabilities and ensuring that they receive services and get the support they need throughout this period that we're all going through and into the future as we hopefully resume back to some sense of normalcy. So what the purpose of the alliance is, you can see on the screen, is to ensure continuity of those services during this remote instruction. I think it's important to point out there's no advocacy involved in this. This is about helping support educators get great resources that are out there, that are evidence-based and curated so that they can serve students who learn differently during this time of challenge. If we go to the next slide, you can see who our founding partners are. There we are, the National Center for Special Education and Charter Schools, Innovate EDU, NCLD, Brooklyn Lab, and ISTE. We're really excited to come together. It happened incredibly quickly as we all had to respond to this crisis so quickly. Now we are excited that so many other groups have joined with us to provide resources and expertise and to support this effort. In fact, I'm sure there might be many of you on the phone who are members or are partners in this and don't see your logos. We're adding many more partners every day, and we certainly hope to make this the biggest tent possible. So with that, we want to provide you with some just clear, factual, updated information today. I'm going to pass this over to Ace Parsi, Director of Innovation at NCLD. Ace?
Thank you, Lindsay. I know this has been a stressful time for all of us, as you could see in the picture at the very beginning. When before this crisis started, I had a lot more hair. So anyway, I know that we are all just reacting to what's happening, and things seem to be changing every day. There's things that are happening in our own homes. If you're an educator listening to this, that there's new demands in terms of your schedule, how you interact with your students, and some of us have our own family commitments. So in light of that, one of the clear imperatives that EALA is working to meet is making sure that there's only just one, you have to go to one site to get the best resources and information related to how we serve kids with disabilities under this crisis. It's important to note within that, that this crisis didn't wave away all the hard-fought civil rights laws and protections that young people with disabilities are entitled to in order to get the highest quality education. That these protections and these laws and that are in place have taken decades to secure civil rights of students, and that they may have different implications now, but those protections and the fundamental underlying belief under them are still in place. So that includes the Americans with Disabilities Act, and specifically within Title II of the ADA, which requires schools to make educational opportunities, extracurricular activities, and facilities open to and accessible to all students. Again, if you're providing that education to some of your students, it's important that kids with disabilities still are protected under that ADA. There's the Technology Act, which previously includes funding for assistive technology for students with disabilities. There's new demands and greater demand for that assistive technology in light of the fact that most kids, if they're experiencing education, are doing it in a virtual setting. There's the Every Student Succeeds Act, which my colleague Megan Whitaker will talk more about in terms of the developments with that, but that has specific provisions around accountability and subgroup measurement of making sure that we're making progress for all students, including those with disabilities. Of course, there's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that includes the rights of different student disability groups and a right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. Thinking about how that is impacted by our current crisis when students are learning, their learning environment is often in their home setting. And then there's the rights under the Section 504 and 508 of the Rehabilitation Act that includes specifics of working in tandem with the ADA, rights of individuals with disabilities and young people with disabilities to have that opportunity to not be discriminated against in their learning environments and in their learning opportunities. So these laws and the civil rights protections and the funding sources and things that they support are still in place, and we are navigating how they are applied into the new environments where our students are learning. The other thing that I want to note is that within the education space, there is more than enough terms of art, whether it's accessibility or now in the virtual education space, you will see a lot of things in terms of synchronous and asynchronous communication, like how students are learning, whether they're learning from their teachers in that moment or they're looking at video in the future. It's important to note that all these different features will interact with the protections that students have under the previous laws. So if a student with a disability, with dyslexia, for example, can't follow the chat features in a synchronous communication context, that is an accommodation that student will need. So it's, and we at NCLD have created just the two pagers, one that includes just the background of some of these laws, and another one around these key terms in terms of online learning and education technology. I think that we're including it in the chat, but we'll also include it in the follow-up message to this. But it's important to think about how these two things, the current laws that we have and the context that we have, interact with each other. And so I'll kick it over to my colleague, Megan Whitaker, who will talk more about that and what's been happening.
Great, thank you, Ace. And so before we get into the policy landscape and the recent guidance that has been issued, I want to take a second to give a quick overview of the components of IDEA. As Ace mentioned, one of the most fundamental laws that protects students with disabilities and ensures that they receive the services that they need. And I think that this overview will help us understand more specifically what the U.S. Department of Education is calling on schools to do right now. First, IDEA requires the identification of students with disabilities. Through its child find provisions, IDEA requires that schools identify, locate, and evaluate all children who have disabilities. It also requires the school to make determinations about which children with disabilities need special education and related services, and those students may fall into any of the 13 categories under the law. And second, IDEA entitles those eligible students to certain things. It entitles them to a free, appropriate public education. We often call it FAPE, which is education that's designed to meet that child's individual needs. And those needs are then going to be outlined in their IEP. It also requires that FAPE be delivered in the least restrictive environment, or the LRE, which means that the child must be educated to the maximum extent appropriate alongside their non-disabled peers. And FAPE is also then provided through the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, which lays out the specialized instruction, the related services, and any supplementary aids or services that would need to be provided for that child to make progress in the general ed curriculum. And of course, we have to acknowledge that, while schools have to continue to uphold the law and provide these things to students, they're also being forced to operate very differently than they did just weeks ago. And what schools are doing in this regard has to look different. And the Department of Education recognizes that. And so recently issued several pieces of guidance to help districts and schools navigate those obligations during this time. There were at least 4 pieces of relevant guidance that the department issued related to students with disabilities, particularly under IDEA. And I'm going to share some of those important takeaways here. First, the department reaffirmed that there is an obligation to provide FAPE to students. Schools must ensure that students with disabilities have equal access, but they've also, in the same turn, acknowledged that FAPE, how it's provided, can and will look different right now because we are operating in different circumstances. And the guidance acknowledged that some instruction or some services will be provided virtually. Some may require certain kinds of assistive technology. For some students, it may even have to happen by phone. And for others, that instructional material may have to be provided, by print. So it's going to depend on each child's unique needs, and not every child is going to need the same things, but the requirement is that you must provide FAPE for each child. And the bottom line is that it just must be individualized. They're not prescribing any specific methods, but they are calling on schools to make sure that there's equal access and that all education is equally effective for students with disabilities. And the department did recognize that that inherently built into IDEA, there is flexibility that already exists. IDEA allows for IEP teams to hold meetings remotely or virtually. It also allows IEP teams that include parents to agree to different timelines for those IEP meetings, for reevaluations, and for other things, so long as they are coming to that agreement together. And at the same time, the department acknowledges that some evaluations may need to be postponed if they can only be done in person. Next slide, please, Ace. But where meetings can be accomplished virtually by phone, or where services can be provided that way, they should be. Parents and schools are encouraged to come to agreements about the services that can and will be provided, and to come up with a plan on how those services will be provided that works for the student and the family. And to help make that possible, the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education also released some guidance indicating that they would be using discretion when it comes to their enforcement of HIPAA, which is the Privacy Protection Act related to health. And that would really has freed up many more platforms that schools can now use for telepractice and service delivery that is remote. And so the department's guidance really encourages states to be thinking now and planning for the best way to deliver these services now, and also the types of compensatory services that will be needed in the future for those students for whom even the best efforts around virtual learning might fall short. And so overall, these pieces of guidance really encourage schools to do one thing, and that is to partner with families to provide the best services and instruction that they can under these circumstances, keeping in line with the intent of IDEA, and developing a plan to just make up for any of the shortcomings when school resumes or when the circumstances improve. Next slide, please. And the department's guidance, while it lays a framework and sets the parameters that schools and districts should be operating within to remain in compliance with IDEA, there are other sources of information out there that might be relevant to you and would be worth looking at. Of course, there are the resources here on Educating All Learners, but I'd also encourage you to look to what your own state has done or any guidance that they have issued. many states have issued guidance and some have even come up with very clear policies that may differ from what you were doing just 6 weeks ago. So please be sure to look at those policies and make sure that your procedures are in line with them. While they all do align with federal law, some of them offer more clarity or actual processes to follow to be sure you're staying in compliance with what your state is expecting. And then in addition, there are other national organizations like NCLD who are working to create resources to help educators serve these students and their families. So there are 2 documents that we've created that focus specifically on providing FAPE and on collaborating with parents and families. And those, I think, are the 2 most essential elements to be thinking about during this time. And there will certainly be more resources to come, both from national organizations and alliances, as well as, I'm sure, from the department. Next slide, please. And, of course, to do all of this, we know that additional funding is needed. And Congress has taken one step to really support these efforts and equip schools with the resources that they need. The CARES Act is the most recent stimulus bill that was passed by Congress to address COVID-19, and that became law on March 27th. The CARES Act provided about $30 billion in education funding. However, only about $13 billion of that will be available for K-12 education. And that money will be distributed to states and then to districts using a Title I kind of formula, and really focusing on ensuring that money gets into the highest need areas. And the funds can be used for a variety of purposes, such as planning for distance learning and planning for school closures, as well as making sure that students have internet access and devices that they need. And then there's also another $3 billion that will be made available to governors, and they can use it at their discretion. So while there's no requirement how it be used, it can go either to K-12 education or to institutions of higher education that are being impacted by this. And then I think the third important provision in the CARES Act was a directive to the Secretary of Education. And within 30 days of the law being enacted, she has to submit to Congress a report on the waivers she would like to be able to grant under these education laws, such as IDEA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the Higher Education Act, and Perkins, which is the Career Tech Ed Act. So waivers would essentially free states from certain obligations in terms of compliance with those different laws. So looking ahead to what to expect, that report from the Secretary will be submitted by April 26th, if not earlier. That's the 30-day mark. And that report will essentially lead to additional conversations at the federal level about waivers and what happens next in education in terms of state and district obligations. And then the House is currently on recess right now. They will return on May 4th, though that date can still be pushed out further depending on what's happening and what the COVID-19 situation is at that point. But when the House does return, we expect Congress to begin negotiating another large stimulus package, which will hopefully include more funding for K-12 education to support teachers and districts during this time. And in the meantime, the Secretary will begin accepting applications from states and just dispersing that $13 billion that came through the CARES Act. So there is potential for more federal action in the next month, both from the Secretary and from Congress, and that will shape kind of education for students with disabilities going forward. And we will continue to monitor that and keep everyone up to date on the latest. So with that, Ace, I think we can go to the next slide, which is questions.
Great. And Gabby, could I ask you just because I have my screen out, if anybody has questions that we can answer, you can get our contact information afterwards as well, but just type them up into the chat, and Gabby, if you wouldn't mind like moderating and asking us those questions.
Absolutely. And we do have 2 so far. So I think this is kind of going off of what you said, Megan. So how long will the HIPAA relaxation last?
I don't believe there was an end date. It just said effective immediately. They're using their discretion in terms of enforcement. So I don't know that we have an end date in mind. They will likely continue to issue guidance as the situation evolves.
All righty. And then another one is, so someone thought that schools were only required to follow FERPA and not HIPAA. Is that correct?
So I'll jump in with this one. This is Lindsay. And in general, typically schools are not required to follow HIPAA. As you point out, they're covered. Educational records are covered by FERPA, but there are more and more instances of schools offering medical services to students. These would be things like vaccinations or medical clinics that might be a part of the school. In that case, And depending on how it might be covered under these circumstances, how schools are choosing to continue to provide some of those services if they need to, that's why OCR released this regulation. In those cases, HIPAA would apply, but it is not in your, it wouldn't apply to your IEP records or your traditional educational records. It's really applying, as HIPAA does, to the electronic transactions of medical records.
Awesome, thank you. So kind of on that note, do you have a few examples of states who have guidelines for special education that people can use as references?
Yeah, so there are, if you look at NCLD's website, ncld.org/COVID-19, we provide in our policy and practice like bright spots documents, both relating to FAPE and collaboration. There are examples from teachers as well as from state policy documents about what that might look like. I don't necessarily think any state is doing everything well, but there are pieces of guidance that I think we can highlight where states are holding a high standard and are trying to provide a lot of clarity to their districts. But our NCLD resource does have several examples in there.
Awesome. And I did link to that, the link she mentioned in the chat for anyone. So again, that's ncld.org/COVID-19. So there was another question. Are there any initial recommendations or resources for schools to prepare high school seniors with IEPs for exiting high school?
So I don't know that there are resources that exist. This is a question I think that's come up a lot in recent weeks. I would say that the most important thing is to continue implementing the plans that you've had in place. Reaching out to families to identify what the situation is at home for them and their child, and then working to make any kind of modifications you might need to continue that transition plan for students. I would think that by now, at this point of the year for a senior, those plans are pretty well established and have been in place. So I would encourage them to just continue working with families to implement them now and kind of adapt them for these circumstances and do as much as they can virtually.
And I just want to add to that, what a great recommendation. I think that's exactly the type of content we want to offer on this site. And I know there's already so much great content being reviewed, but we'll bring this, so there could be, I don't have an immediate link to it right now. I don't know, Gabby, if you know of one, you could drop it in, but we'll definitely take that back to the content team to make sure they cover that.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of similarly to that question, someone else was asking, should there be accommodation for their child or change to the way their education is provided during this time?
So I think that's going to be on an individual basis. There is nothing stopping an IEP team meeting from happening, right? Involving the parent and sitting down to assess what is the environment like at home and what are the challenges a student might face now that they weren't facing in school. The environment in a school is very different than home. And so I think it is important for every IEP team to be thinking about that and asking that question. It's not necessarily yes, it just depends on the circumstance. A child might need different kinds of structures and supports at home than they didn't at school. So I think it is an important question for every IEP team to consider.
And just to think about the same sort of issues that might change the need for accommodations. Like if you have ADHD and you're in a traditional classroom, you might get preferential seating because to just limit the distractions that you have. In home, that might be a whole different set of distractions. And also with the technology, whatever the learning management system that somebody's using, that platform itself could provide all different sorts of distractions. So like how do you, to assess your learning management system platforms and think about what those distractions and those issues that related to the accommodations the students need, how those accommodations now might be different in light of the change of the learning environment.
And I think many of the platforms that schools are using have a lot of built-in accessibility features that they may not be aware of. And so I think it's really important for districts and educators to be exploring those technologies and providing trainings to educators and to parents so that everybody is aware of what's built in and already accessible for students that might support their learning better at home.
And just one more plug for content on the site. There's great information about Google Classroom and its accessibility tools. They'll send you information about others like Microsoft OneNote and things, but definitely something we want to make sure people have ready access to.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And someone was kind of addressing some of those challenges that you all mentioned, in that they're wondering how this impacts IEP teams and determination of compensatory services. For example, if a school district is not providing any new content, only enrichment activities, is it difficult for IEP teams to justify compensatory services?
I think, that is a larger issue we're going to have to look at as we move forward. It's definitely not the typical way we operate under that construct as it's currently included in the law. And I think we will be looking to the Department of Education for more guidance around that as we go forward. So not a perfect answer to that right now, but definitely it's a question we all need to be considering.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So in terms of NCLD and EALA, are there any resources for schools that outline a procedure on determining ways to assess regression?
I don't know if you guys want to speak to EALA. What we've been speaking about a lot in the policy space is that this will be an issue not just for students with disabilities, but for all students, and that it's going to be very important for schools to develop that process. But I don't know if there's other content that you guys are familiar with.
No, I think, it's similar to what Lindsay said. It's an ongoing process, and we've used the metaphor of crawling, walking, and running. And I think a lot of us feel like we're in that crawl stage. So those are really important issues to raise. And I'm hoping that as we move forward, especially as we curate content from all of our partners, that we can address those exact questions. So it's a valuable thing to just include in this chat, and also to any questions that you have to the EALA content team through that platform.
Yeah. Yeah, so someone is asking for a bit of clarification in terms of equal access, and what does that exactly mean? So we're saying that since not every student has access to teletherapy, no student can have that teletherapy. So are there guidelines on that?
So I think the standard way we think about this, equal access meaning equal access to the content and curriculum and the learning in the classroom. So not every student is going to need some kind of teletherapy or other service to access their education, but some students with disabilities will. So those students with disabilities need to have those services that give them access to the classroom and what's being taught in the classroom. It's not necessarily a one-for-one, every student gets the same thing. It's the same that I think it's been in school generally. Not every child gets the same services or instruction.
Absolutely. So as we kind of wrap up, do you all have your information available that people could reach out to you if they have any follow-up?
Yes. So for me at least, I could put mine out there. It's aparsi@ncld.org, and I can also forward any other questions that people have for Megan and Lindsay to them directly. So,
so I'll go ahead and add your email to the chat. And again, I'll add EALA's website to the chat so people can reference that for any follow-up questions. And once again, this recording will be made available on the EALA website as well as the slides. So if you have any other questions or want to find any more resources, it'll all be there.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for taking the time to join this webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you everyone. Have a great rest of your days.